The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clean streets of Pine Grove as James Washington guided his well-maintained 2010 Honda Civic toward home. His weathered hands, marked by decades of service, rested easily on the steering wheel as he reflected on another fulfilling day at the Veterans Hospital. At 72, he still volunteered 3 times a week, helping younger vets navigate their benefits and sharing stories that brought comfort to those struggling to adjust to civilian life. He smiled, remembering the young Marine he helped today, the boy. And at James's age, they all seemed like boys. Had been struggling with paperwork for his medical benefits. James had sat with him for 2 hours, carefully explaining each form, sharing his own experiences, and watching the tension slowly ease from the young man's shoulders. It was moments like these that kept him coming back, week after week. The clock on his dashboard read 4:45 p.m. His wife Linda would be waiting with dinner. Tuesday was always pot roast night, a tradition they'd kept for 40 years. The smell of pot roast and potatoes would be filling their modest 2-story home right about now. James adjusted his collar, making sure his tie was straight. Even after retirement, he believed in looking presentable, a habit from his military days that he'd never shaken. The police cruiser's lights flashing in his rearview mirror caught him by surprise. James checked his speedometer. He'd been going exactly the speed limit, just as he always did. He signaled and pulled over carefully, positioning his car well off the road for safety. His movements were calm and practiced as he turned off the engine, placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, and reached for his wallet with slow, deliberate motions. Through his side mirror, James watched the officer approach. Something about the way the man walked, aggressive and rushed, made the hairs on the back of James's neck stand up. In 30 years of military service and 2 decades of civilian life after that, he developed a good sense for reading people. This wasn't going to be a pleasant encounter. The officer's footsteps crunched on the gravel, unnecessarily heavy. James took a deep breath, reminding himself of the countless times he trained young officers in proper conduct and procedure. Stay calm, stay professional, set the example, the same principles he lived by all his life. He kept his eyes forward, hands visible, waiting for the tap on his window that would begin what he already suspected would be a very different kind of challenge than his peaceful afternoon at the hospital. His military ID and distinguished service records lay tucked in his wallet, but James had learned long ago that some people only see what they expect to see. As the officer's shadow fell across his side mirror, James straightened his shoulders slightly, keeping his expression neutral. The next few minutes would test every ounce of patience and dignity he'd cultivated over his lifetime of service. The officer rapped on the window with his knuckles, much harder than necessary. James pressed the button to lower it smoothly, letting in the cool evening air. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. His nameplate read Officer Barrett, though he positioned himself so that James had to strain to read it. "Of course, officer," James replied calmly, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone who'd commanded troops for decades. He moved his right hand slowly toward the glove compartment, narrating his actions just as he taught countless young people to do. "I'm reaching for my registration from the glove compartment now, and then I'll get my license from my wallet." "Just hurry up," Barrett snapped, his hand resting unnecessarily on his holster. "And don't try anything funny." James kept his face neutral as he retrieved the documents, though his heart grew heavy. He'd seen this behavior before, had dealt with it throughout his career, but it never stopped being disappointing. He handed over his license and registration with steady hands, making sure to keep his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Barrett snatched the papers, barely glancing at them. "You ran that stop sign back there," he declared, though James knew with absolute certainty that he hadn't. He'd stopped at every sign, just as he always did. "With all due respect, officer," James began, his tone measured and professional, "I came to a complete stop at every intersection. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. Are you saying I'm lying? Barrett's voice rose sharply. Because I know what I saw. You people always think you know better, don't you? The words hung in the air like smoke. James felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Not fear, but the weight of history. He'd faced this kind of prejudice before, had overcome it through excellence and dignity. Even now, with gray hair and decades of service behind him, he still had to prove his humanity to some people. Sir, I'm simply stating what occurred, James replied, his voice steady despite the growing tension. If you check your dash camera footage, step out of the vehicle. Barrett interrupted, taking a step back and gesturing aggressively. Now. James noticed another patrol car pulling up behind them, its lights also flashing. He carefully undid his seatbelt, still moving with deliberate slowness. The pot roast would be getting cold at home, he thought absurdly. Linda would be worried. He was never late for dinner. As he opened his door, his old knee injury from a training exercise in '82 made itself known. He gripped the door frame for support as he stood, maintaining his dignity despite the officer's impatient huffing. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, and passing cars slowed to watch the scene unfold. Hands where I can see them, Barrett barked, though James's hands were already clearly visible. You seem to have an attitude problem, old man. Maybe we need to have a conversation of respecting authority. The irony of those words almost made James smile, thinking of the thousands of young officers he trained in real authority. The kind earned through respect, not demanded through force. But he kept his expression neutral, standing straight despite his aching knee. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the strongest response to ignorance was simply to maintain your dignity. The backup officers were approaching now, their footsteps on the pavement adding to the tension of the moment. James could feel the dash camera recording everything, documenting another small chapter in a long history of similar encounters. But unlike many others who'd faced this situation, James knew something that Officer Barrett didn't. Sometimes, justice needed a witness to find its voice. The first drops of rain began to fall as James stood beside his car, his bad knee protesting the movement. Officer Barrett circled him like a shark, shining his flashlight directly in James's face despite the early evening light being more than adequate to see. The backup officers stood a few feet away, their discomfort evident in their shifting stances. Spread your legs. Hands on the hood, Barrett commanded, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction that made James's stomach turn. The metal of the car hood was cool and wet under James's palms. He thought about all the young recruits he trained over the years, how he always emphasized that authority came with responsibility, not power trips. Sir, one of the backup officers spoke up, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. I don't think this is necessary. His license and registration check out fine. Barrett ignored her, roughly patting down James's legs. The rain was falling steadily now, soaking through James's carefully pressed shirt. His tie, the one his granddaughter had given him last Father's Day, dripped water onto his polished shoes. Still, he kept his posture straight, his dignity intact. What's in your pockets, old-timer? Barrett demanded, though he could clearly feel nothing suspicious through the pat-down. Any weapons I should know about? Drugs, maybe. James almost laughed at that. In 40 years of service, he'd never even had a parking ticket. No, sir, he replied steadily. Just my wallet, my phone, and some mints. Would you like me to show you? Getting smart with me. Barrett's voice took on a harder edge. He stepped closer, trying to intimidate. Maybe we should take this downtown, run a full check. I bet you've got something to hide. The rain drummed harder on the pavement, and passing cars sprayed water as they slowed to watch. James could see people in their windows now, some holding up phones to record. Good, he thought. Let them see. Let them witness. Officer, James said calmly, water running down his face, I understand you're doing your job. But I've been standing in this rain for 15 minutes now. I'm a senior citizen with a documented service injury, and you haven't given me any valid reason for this detention." A car door slammed behind them. Another officer had arrived, this one wearing lieutenant's bars. James kept his position, hands on the hood, but he could hear the sharp intake of breath from the new arrival. The backup officers were whispering now, their faces showing growing concern. One kept looking between James and a photo on her phone, her eyes widening. Barrett, oblivious to the changing atmosphere, continued his harassment. "You don't tell me how to do my job," Barrett snapped, but there was a new thread of uncertainty in his voice. Maybe he was finally noticing how the other officers were acting. Maybe he was realizing that this stop had gone on far too long to justify. "I decide when you're free to go." James thought about Linda at home, probably calling his phone by now. He thought about the young Marine he helped earlier, about the lessons he still had to teach. Sometimes the best way to fight injustice wasn't with anger or force, but with patience and wisdom. He'd learned that lesson the hard way, through years of breaking down barriers and changing minds. The lieutenant was walking toward them now, her pace quick and purposeful. James could tell from the sound of her footsteps that something was about to change. He remained still, the rain running down his face, knowing that sometimes justice needed more than just a witness. It needed the right moment to reveal itself. Lieutenant Thompson stopped mid-stride, her eyes fixed on James's face. Recognition flickered across her features as the rain continued to fall around them. Just last month, she'd been sitting in the third row of the community center, watching this same man receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his service to both country and community. "Colonel Washington," she called out, her voice cutting through the sound of falling rain. "Colonel James Washington." The effect was immediate. Barrett's hand, which had been reaching for his handcuffs, froze in midair. The other officers straightened their postures instinctively, years of military respect training kicking in. James remained steady, hands still on the hood of his car, water dripping from his silver hair. "Yes, Lieutenant," he replied calmly, as if they were meeting at a community function rather than during an unwarranted traffic stop. "I believe we met at last month's police community relations ceremony. You gave quite an inspiring speech about building trust between law enforcement and citizens." Barrett's face drained of color as he looked between his lieutenant and the man he'd been harassing. The phone recordings from nearby cars suddenly felt like spotlights on his behavior. He took a small step back, his earlier bravado evaporating like the rain on hot pavement. "Sir," Lieutenant Thompson moved forward quickly, her voice filled with respect and embarrassment. "Please, you don't need to. Officer Lee, get the colonel an umbrella from my car immediately." James straightened up slowly, his knee stiff from the prolonged standing. He adjusted his soap tie with dignity, smoothed down his wet shirt, and turned to face them. The gathered crowd of onlookers had grown, their phones capturing every moment of this remarkable turn of events. "Colonel Washington is the head of our Police Oversight Committee," Lieutenant Thompson explained, her voice carrying clearly to Barrett and the other officers. "He's also a 30-year Air Force veteran who's trained half the police academies in this state on proper conduct and community relations." The young officer returned with an umbrella, holding it over James with shaking hands. Barrett looked like he might be sick, suddenly remembering every dismissive word, every aggressive gesture he made toward this respected community leader. "Sir, I didn't." Barrett stammered, but James held up a hand. "Officer Barrett," James said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of leadership, "in my career, I've learned that moments like these aren't about personal embarrassment or revenge. They're about growth and change." He paused, looking at each officer in turn. "Now, about that dash camera footage." The small crowd that had gathered broke into scattered applause. A few people were nodding in recognition. James was well known in the community for his volunteer work and mentoring programs. Some were already posting the videos online, the story spreading faster than the rain that continued to fall. Lieutenant Thompson stepped forward, her face set with determination. "Colonel, I'd assure you, this incident will be thoroughly reviewed. Would you be willing to come to the station to make a formal statement? And please, let us drive you home. Your wife called dispatch worried about you." James thought about Linda waiting at home, about the cold pot roast, about the thousands of other people who'd faced similar treatment without the protection of rank or recognition. Sometimes, he realized, respect had to be earned not just through service, but through how you handled life's hardest moments. "Of course, Lieutenant," he replied, straightening his shoulders despite his wet clothes and aching knee. "But first, I believe Officer Barrett and I need to have a conversation about what real authority looks like." He turned to the younger officer, whose face was a mix of shame and fear. "Consider this your first lesson." Inside the police station's conference room, James sat with a towel around his shoulders and a cup of hot coffee warming his hands. The rain had finally stopped, but its effects lingered in his damp clothes and aching joints. Lieutenant Thompson sat across from him, her face showing a mix of respect and concern as she reviewed the dash camera footage. "This is completely unacceptable," she said, pausing the video. "Colonel Washington, I want to personally apologize for Officer Barrett's conduct. This isn't what we stand for, and it's certainly not what you've taught us over the years." James took a slow sip of his coffee, thinking carefully about his next words. Through the conference room's glass walls, he could see officers gathering, whispering among themselves. Some he recognized from training sessions he'd conducted. Others were new faces, watching him with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "Lieutenant," he began, setting down his cup, "when I was commanding troops, I learned something important about moments like these. They're not just problems to be solved. They're opportunities for real change." The door opened, and the police chief walked in, his face grave. "Colonel Washington," he said, extending his hand. "I came as soon as I heard. The mayor's on his way too. This is—" A teaching moment, James finished for him, his voice firm but kind. "Chief, please, sit down. We need to talk about more than just one officer's actions today." Outside the conference room, Officer Barrett sat alone on a bench, his head in his hands. The viral videos of the incident were already spreading across social media, with thousands of shares and comments. His career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for hung in the balance. Barrett's record shows 3 other complaints of similar behavior. Lieutenant Thompson reported, sliding over a file. But they were all dismissed due to lack of evidence. This time, with the dash cam footage and civilian videos. James raised his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Instead of focusing on punishment, let's talk about prevention. How many other officers might have similar attitudes they're not even aware of? How many good people are making bad decisions because of biases they've never confronted?" The chief leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you suggesting, Colonel?" "I'm suggesting we use this incident as a catalyst for department-wide change," James replied, pulling out a small notebook from his pocket. Despite its water damage from the rain, the pages were still readable. "I've been developing a training program for the past 5 years. It's based on real experiences, mine and others. Maybe it's time to put it into action." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the faces of those gathered in the conference room. James could see the weight of the moments settling on their shoulders. This wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It was about addressing the deeper issues that had led to it. "And Officer Barrett?" Lieutenant Thompson asked carefully. James stood up slowly, his knee still protesting but his spine straight. "Have him come in," he said. "He should be part of this conversation. Real change doesn't happen through punishment alone. It happens through understanding, education, and accountability." As an officer went to fetch Barrett, James looked out the window at the clearing sky. He thought about Linda, who had already brought a fresh set of clothes to the station for him. He thought about the young Marine from earlier that day, about his grandchildren, about all the people who would be affected by what happened next. "You know," he said, Turning back to the room, when I was walking into the Veterans Hospital this morning, I never imagined I'd be here now. But sometimes the most important lessons come when we least expect them. The question is, are we ready to learn? The next morning, local news vans lined up outside the police department as James walked through the front doors, freshly pressed suit replacing his rain-soaked clothes from the day before. The videos of his traffic stop had gone viral overnight, with millions of views and thousands of comments demanding action. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Officers who normally hurried past with barely a nod now stopped to listen as James spoke with the police chief and city officials. They could see something different happening. Not the usual damage control, but real, meaningful change in the making. The dash camera footage tells a clear story, the chief said, displaying the video on the conference room screen. Officer Barrett's conduct was completely out of line. But Colonel Washington has proposed something more significant than just disciplinary action. James stood slowly, his knee feeling better after a good night's rest. Linda had insisted on driving him to the station today, worried after yesterday's events. But she'd also reminded him of something important, that throughout his career, he'd always found ways to turn difficult moments into opportunities for growth. Yesterday wasn't just about one officer or one traffic stop. James began, his voice carrying the same authority that had commanded troops and trained countless officers. It's about patterns we need to address. Officer Barrett's actions didn't happen in a vacuum. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The public is demanding his badge, Colonel. The videos are everywhere. We need to show we're taking strong action. Firing one officer won't solve the underlying problems, James replied, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a thick folder, the training program he'd been developing for years. What we need is comprehensive reform. New training protocols, regular community engagement, and most importantly, a change in department culture. Outside the conference room, Officer Barrett sat waiting, his uniform impeccable, but his face showing the strain of a sleepless night. The viral videos had made him infamous overnight. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from family and friends who'd seen the footage. Bring him in, James instructed, and an officer opened the door. Barrett entered, his steps uncertain, his eyes unable to meet James's gaze. The room fell silent. Officer Barrett, James said, his voice firm but not unkind, yesterday, you showed us exactly what needs to change. Today, you're going to help us change it. Barrett's head snapped up in surprise. He'd expected anger, punishment, the end of his career. Instead, he saw something different in the older man's eyes. Determination, yes, but also hope. Sir? Barrett's voice cracked slightly. You have two choices, James continued. You can resign, which is what many people are calling for. Or you can be part of the solution. You can help us identify where the training failed, where biases crept in, and how we can do better. It won't be easy. You'll need to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself. But in the end, you might help prevent other officers from making the same mistakes. The room was silent as Barrett processed these words. Outside, reporters were gathering for the upcoming press conference. Social media was buzzing with speculation about what actions would be taken. The choice is yours, James concluded, but remember, true authority comes from how we handle our mistakes and what we learn from them. Yesterday, you showed us what's wrong. Today, you can help us make it right. The mayor looked skeptical, but James held up his hand. Sometimes, he said, the best way to fight injustice is to transform it into something positive. We're not just trying to punish one officer, we're trying to change a system. 6 months later, James stood at the podium in the police academy's main hall, looking out at the fresh faces of new recruits. The room was packed, with current officers joining the cadets for this special training session. In the back row, Officer Barrett sat quietly, taking notes, no longer in uniform, but still part of the change he'd helped create. When I was pulled over that rainy evening, James began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. I had two choices. I could let anger take over, or I could use that moment to create lasting change. Today, we're here because we chose change. The projector behind him showed clips from dash cameras and body cameras, not just from his incident, but from other stops that highlighted both good and bad police work. Each clip had been carefully selected to teach, not shame. In the months since that day, our department has changed, he continued, gesturing to the statistics on the screen. Complaints are down 40%. Community trust is up. And most importantly, our officers are learning to see beyond their first impressions. In the front row, Lieutenant Thompson nodded. She'd been instrumental in implementing the new training programs, working late nights with James to refine procedures and build better community relationships. The local news had dubbed it the Washington Protocol, a comprehensive approach to police reform that was already drawing attention from other cities. But numbers don't tell the whole story, James said, stepping away from the podium to walk closer to his audience. Let me tell you about last week. I was at the grocery store when a young officer approached me. He'd been through this training program, and he told me about a traffic stop he handled differently because of what he'd learned here. The room was silent, everyone leaning forward slightly. He said he caught himself making assumptions about the driver, just like Officer Barrett had done with me. But then he remembered our discussions about conscious decision-making. He stepped back, took a breath, and approached that stop with a fresh perspective. That officer turned what could have been another incident into a positive interaction. James paused, letting his words sink in. In the back of the room, Barrett straightened in his chair. After months of intensive training and community service, he'd become one of the strongest advocates for the new program. His story, from that rainy night to today, had become a powerful teaching tool. Change isn't just about new policies, James continued, his voice warm but firm. It's about the choices we make every day. It's about remembering that behind every traffic stop, every call, every interaction, there are human beings with stories we don't yet know. Linda, sitting in the front row, smiled up at her husband. She'd supported him through countless late nights working on this program, understanding that this was about more than just one incident. It was about leaving a legacy of positive change. Today, as part of your training, you'll hear from community members, from veteran officers, and yes, from Officer Barrett himself. Their stories aren't comfortable to hear, but growth rarely comes from comfort. James looked at his watch, the same one he'd been wearing that rainy evening. You know, people often ask me if I'm angry about what happened that day. The truth is, I'm grateful. Not for the injustice, but for the opportunity it gave us to make real change. He picked up a stack of training manuals from the podium. These guidelines we've developed together aren't just rules to follow. They're tools to help you become the kind of officers our community needs. The kind who see people first, not stereotypes. The kind who understand that true authority comes from respect, not fear. As he looked out at the faces before him, young and old, representing every background, James felt a deep sense of hope. The incident that could have ended in bitterness had instead sparked a movement of positive change, rippling out far beyond their small community. Remember, he concluded, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through years of service, every interaction is a chance to build trust, to show respect, to make our community stronger. That rainy evening taught us all something important. It's not about who we were yesterday, but who we choose to be today.